pre-clinical stage. And so we're doing an early feasibility study for the VAD, for the Jarvik 2015. And that's...
Yeah. And I think that the Pumpkin study or the Pumpkin trial and the Jarvik is a great example of the challenges of pediatric medical devices. As a clinician who takes care of patients, but is also that person who, as you were talking about, is the technical aspect of how good your device is dependent upon the people in the field using it. And you can have the best medical device, but if the people in the field either don't have the trust in the device or don't have the training or the education or the motivation to push it forward, to a certain degree, you're dead in the water. Right. You, as much as you need to go often to the FDA, you also have to go often to the clinicians who are in the field who might use the product, because those are the people who are exceedingly motivated to push the product forward, because we answer to patients. And really, in the end, we're all here to improve the outcomes for our patients. And there's nothing more impactful than having a mother in the room saying, "Save my child." And you have no devices to do that. And so that's really how the infant Jarvik came to light, is because we are the only FDA-approved device for mechanical circulatory support is the Berlin heart. This is a device created in the 1990s, got EU and then subsequently Health Canada approval in the early 2000s, and then really wasn't until around 2011 got approval for here in the US. This is the only device that we use on label, but we have prolific off-label use of pretty much every other medical device. So the hardware, the HeartMate 3, and we use this rampantly, and we have data. And so that kind of leads to the next panel discussion on what do we do with the data that is being collected currently in the real world, and how can that help inform our decisions regarding safety and efficacy in the real world, which is really what we all live in right now, and what our patients live in. And I would like to advocate strongly for the use of real-world data and organize this data with people who have a lot of mindful input about how do you organize a randomized controlled trial, and with the FDA to have the utmost quality of this data so that it can be used in terms of the decision-making for labeling of these devices. Because the reality is, as with the Pumpkin device, that we came to realization it was very difficult to actually enroll enough patients for the trial. And while the trial is ongoing and we're still very enthusiastic to put it forward, we come to a lot of just logistical challenges that can really delay the availability of this device through the process.
But if I could just step back a little bit more early on in the Pumpkin program, so for those of you who may not be familiar, the Pumpkin program, it's called a program because it funded 5 different devices through the preclinical stage, and of those 5 devices, 1 has now made it into the clinical stage, and NHLBI provided roughly $24 million for just that preclinical phase. So this just goes towards the challenges, both regulatory and kind of market dynamics, I think kind of go hand in hand, such that now that we're in the clinical phase, even in the clinical phase, it's taken 2 years to get the Jarvik 2015, the infant Jarvik 2015, really up into enrolling. I mean, right now we have 3 feasibility patients that have been enrolled. We actually got to a point that there were more compassionate use cases that were enrolled in the study than the study itself. And so we had to have conversations of let's stop that insanity so that we can actually get patients into the trial and get that data that we need. And it's extremely challenging. And so I think Pumpkin is the poster child for, the entire program can be a poster child for how difficult it is to get pediatric devices out there.
Well, that's really interesting that you raise compassionate use, because as Christina was talking, I was also thinking the extent to which off-label use also impedes your ability to enroll, and given that there's a lot more off-label use in devices than there are in drugs, why don't we talk about that? Because I do think that that then gets to the heart of, can we find other ways to collect the data, right? And to gather evidence, since it's going to be very difficult for us to power these studies just using a traditional, let's go and enroll in the trial. So why don't we talk a little bit about that?
I agree. That is the rationale for real-world data in this space. So I have a history as being an adult cardiologist where we think about real-world data as the way to get large data sets.
Right.
But I think in the pediatric space, it's more to get tailored devices to what physicians need for their patients, because they're not large populations. So you're not looking for large data sets, but really how do we get reliable data for what's actually happening and what's actually needed. And in that regard, I think the FDA has been very instrumental generally about setting up guidelines for how do we collect real-world data in a way that's reliable, that the data are fit for purpose. So it's not that all real-world data have to meet a certain bar for all indications, but what is it that we're trying to study and how do we get the answers to that? And that's been very important for opening the conversation generally with real-world data. And we have examples exactly for that, both in pediatrics and adult, where the first trigger has been realizing that there's a lot of off-label use in certain areas, whether that's for pediatrics and spine and the use of specific devices that are kind of niche but are being used off-label frequently, where we've been able to use actual data, or in the cardiac space, specific physiologic indications like putting in a lead into the HIS bundle as opposed to where it normally would sit in the ventricle. That was an area where the FDA asked us for more data, and we were able to get an indication expansion by submitting real-world data. So there is a growing body of examples that I think we can apply and be more effective with.
I think it's been a challenge in pediatrics for both devices and drugs in terms of off-label use, mainly because for many years there's obviously not a lot of incentivization to invest from a market perspective to a very small heterogeneous population, and as we get that. And so as a result, we've accommodated and we become so good at using devices and drugs in a way that they weren't intended without any guidelines and just kind of paving the way, that I think now it's almost harder to get patients into studies and to get physicians on board into enrolling in studies, because they say, well, I can just use a Pixaban for that intracardiac clot. I kind of know the dosing. I know they're doing a study somewhere. I'll just modify that dose and use it. We'll just shove that hardware device into that child. I know it's a little bit small, but we'll shoehorn it in because there's no other options. And so when you're faced with there's no other option, the IRB is also exceedingly much more forgiving in many of these circumstances, but in many times we don't even need to go through the IRB because this is in our regards standard of care, because there is no standard of care. So unlike the adult field where there are guides and you get with the guidelines and you follow protocols and you follow expert consensus documents, there's nothing like that for pediatrics. So if I want to use an off-label drug with an off-label device, that's fine, because that's now the new standard of care for that specific patient with that specific anatomy at that specific time.
And that comes into play in the patient enrollment, as you were saying, as well as the clinical trial design. How do you get the endpoints to make sense when the off-label use has virtually become standard of care? So.
Right.
But then, to Lori's point, then you use that off-label data, you use the real-world evidence that's come from that off-label use to help make that case.
Right. But that's the drastic difference to drug trials.
Absolutely.
And so how much education do you find yourself engaged in, though? Because a lot of what we're talking about is in study design, right? To make sure that we can design and execute a feasible study, but you're advocating, though, for people to think beyond sort of our traditional constructs. So how much and where does a lot of that convincing happen? So there's a lot of education that you have to do. Where is that happening mostly? I mean, is it with the IRB? Is it internally with sponsors? I would imagine that there's some discussion at the site level with clinicians, like what does that look like? And with
And with the FDA.
and the FDA. Okay.
I think that's a really good question because I think we're in an evolving field right now, and we don't actually know where steady ground is at this point.
Interesting.
And so, it's not feasible to, at every single institution, talk to 1 million different people because from industry who's trying to put on a trial, it's just too expensive to do that, to go in circles. And I think that was one of the things that we've learned with the pumpkin is that even with really dedicated people putting their heart and soul into having as many of the stakeholders on every single call at all times, we still run into these challenges where people feel like this wasn't the right strategy and we should have done another strategy. So you're never going to please everyone. Right. But I think one approach is starting to work with bigger collaboratives. And so at least in pediatric cardiology, we created this Advanced Cardiac Therapies Improving Outcomes Network, or ACTION, which is a learning collaborative of 36 of the tertiary care pediatric cardiac centers where we primarily use VADs, but we also use a lot of other medical devices. And so with that, we have physicians, we have industry, we have patients, all at the table and working on a bunch of different projects. And so with that kind of cohort of individuals who are really motivated is where you can start infusing education, saying, we want to get X product out to the masses. We want to get this labeled. What is the best way of doing it? And you hear from industry leaders, you hear from clinicians, you also hear from parents whose child is actually actively going through this and say, could you do a randomized control trial of product A versus product B? And they say, I couldn't bear to do that. And we all as clinicians say, well, that doesn't make sense. And then you move forward in that type of stepwise approach. But having a lot of input from all of these centers at once, I think is a valuable thing. And I think there's a lot of these different learning collaboratives for pediatric intensive care, for neonatology, that industry and the FDA can get much more involved in. And the FDA is also one of the partners in ACTION as well. And so I think this is one potential avenue to go through in terms of figuring out what's going to be this evolution.
I think that's wonderful. I mean, that's the sort of the cross-fertilization and sharing that we were talking about earlier. And to use Tara's term, it takes a village for us to be able to do that. So we're almost out of time, and I'm looking for Kalala because she's going to give me the...
Yeah, we have a couple more minutes.
We have a couple more minutes.
And then we'll go to questions.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So, so the one burning question that I have, and you can jump in as you feel free, is if there's one thing that you'd really like people to know about the differences between drugs and devices, what would it be? What are people not getting? And it would certainly be a game changer if indeed they understood that, because then it would sort of catapult us to the next level, if you could pick just one thing.
So I do a lot of research in medical devices, adults and pediatrics, but we don't see a lot of pediatric devices because there's not a lot of incentives, right? Medical devices are hard to do research on to begin with.
Yeah.
And we need to make the incentive so that we've got a lot of smart engineers out there and a lot of smart people, a lot of motivated physicians who want to come up with these therapies, and they don't have the right avenues to do them. Certainly the J Labs, that helps get us there, but I think we need more incentives to do research in development in the pediatric device space. And that's the one thing that, outside of study design and everything, we need to start sooner in that spectrum and provide that incentive.
Yeah. Okay, good.
I would say having sort of the flexibility of the way that we think about the data that are, the clinical evidence that are needed, I think would be the underpinning of what's really different. And the reason that devices are suitable for that, but particularly in the pediatric space, is that devices are generally mechanical, right? Occasionally they have a biological product that's incorporated, but for the most part, they're mechanical. And so when we think about how do they work in a pediatric population, how do they work in different anatomies, it's often a mechanical question, often a proof of concept question with questions about safety that are important things that we study with clinical evidence. But it's thinking about those pieces and being flexible about how we gather that evidence that I think would be the thing that I would emphasize.
Yeah. Well, very good.
I think one of the main issues has just been that there's a lot of great pediatric medical devices, inventors and engineers, and they run out of money. It is a very expensive process to go through this life cycle, and many of them die off before the life cycle is complete. There's never going to be enough money, and so since clinical trials is an area where a lot of the money starts to dissipate very, very quickly, we have to find ways of making it easier, because as the physicians, we all have a good sense of what device is going to do well and which one isn't, and we can usually tell in the first early feasibility. And then after that, people just start using the device prolifically in either compassionate use, humanitarian use, or just off-label altogether. And so rather than go around it after we figure out that it works, why don't we just streamline that process and get to the finish line rather than just kind of playing around with it for years and years and years. And it'll also help working with the insurance companies to get it covered, because nothing incentivizes more than when we know that somebody's going to pay for it. And if we can work with insurers, and that's where you get physician and patient advocacy groups to get together and come and say, you know, my child is alive today because of product X, Y, and Z, that's how you're going to get it through faster.
Yeah, I agree with everything. I think just the variety of answers, I think, proves there's probably not one thing that will catapult this forward. It's just all these little things building upon one another, the real world evidence, the flexibility, the getting the insurers on board, that'll collectively push this forward in a meaningful way.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I see Kalala there. Can we open up for questions? Oh, just two.
Hi, my name is Morgan Elliott, and I'm from Johns Hopkins University in the Institute for Nanobiotechnology. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the combined products that were briefly mentioned and adding biologics and stem cells into a device, which already seems like a very not clear pathway of how to move forward, although commonly encouraged to, at least to us.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Anybody have experience there?
I could speak to it generally, and maybe others will want to comment. But you know, in general, the FDA will look to see what are the properties of the action of the device that you're talking about, whether it's primarily biologic or the device, to help advise which office should be primarily responsible for it. But in general, you'll have both sides of the FDA at the table. From the perspective of development, it's hard to generalize, I suppose. You know, we have many different products that combine a device and drug. I guess in the space that I think of that is applicable to pediatrics, I think about diabetes, where we have devices that sense glucose and administer the drug insulin, as one example. And in that case, we work very closely with both sides, but have had very good relationship working with the FDA specifically for pediatric indications.
Is that it? Oh, great.
We're running really behind. So let's take 10 minutes, not 15 minutes of break. And let's everybody be back in the room by 3:15. 3:15, thank you.